Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to what I'm told is only the second of these events, the Thursday lunchtime events at the RSA. And thank you very much for responding not only to an invitation at very short notice, but braving the weather. I would expect no less, I have to say, from RSA fellows. I'm delighted to welcome on your behalf our distinguished speaker, Allawi, who is a man whose long and impressive career has led to his current and certainly challenging position as senior advisor to the Iraqi Prime Minister. He is a nephew of Ahmed Chalabi, a cousin of the current Prime Minister. He was born in Baghdad, educated in Britain and the United States, has held positions at the World Bank in the Arab Fund. He co-founded his own merchant bank, Arab International Finance, and has held positions at St Anthony's in Oxford. He'll be very well known to many of you from his many media and public appearances. He has a long record of opposition to Iraq's Ba'athist regime, and in September of 2003 was appointed to be Minister of Trade of Iraq under the Iraq Governing Council, followed in April 2004 with his appointment as Iraq's first post-war civilian Minister of Defense. He was then elected to the Transitional National Assembly as a member of the United Iraqi Alliance. He became Minister of Finance in April 2005 in the Transitional National Government. The format of today's proceedings is that Mr. Allawi will talk for around half an hour. We will then take questions for half an hour, and we will wrap up at 2 o'clock. So without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Mr. Allawi.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Since I have half an hour and the subject is Iraq, I'll try to talk about what I think are the essential issues that face the country now, and how did we get into this situation. Basically, the American invasion of Iraq and its subsequent occupation broke a long-standing power structure, not only in Iraq but also in the Middle East. The state system, the nation-state system, that was broken as a result of the invasion of Iraq, was really created as a consequence of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the division of the Middle East into territorial nation-states, countries that have had no experience in the past with the form of politics that are implicit in the construct of a nation-state. The Middle East was either part of a larger empire or was a center of a world empire itself. And when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, it was replaced by a nation-state system that really did not have any historical antecedents to it. So it was an unstable order, and the instability that was inherent in the division and fragmentation of the Middle East created unstable states, and they in turn created all kinds of tumultuous events that led to frequent changes in government, frequent changes in power relationships, and Iraq was no exception to that. And when the Americans invaded, that was really the death knell, as far as I can see, of the nation-state system in the Middle East that started in the end of the Great War, World War I. As a result of the breakdown of the state in Iraq, Iraq has become not only a crisis in and of itself, but it has become a regional crisis and therefore, by extension, a global crisis. Because it disturbs not only the power relationships inside the country, but the outcome of these power struggles inside Iraq will obviously reverberate throughout the Middle East and will affect the internal and the external relationships of a large number of countries that had entered into a kind of unstable equilibrium over the past 100 years. How we resolve these issues in Iraq and how Iraq will come out of this will, in my mind, set the stage for the next phase of the modernity process in the Middle East, whether we're going to have a relatively stable state order or whether we're going to launch another 100 years crisis and perhaps even 100 years war in the Middle East. Basically, the invasion upturned existing power relationships in Iraq and thrust a hitherto underrepresented and in the last 15 years of the Ba'athist regime increasingly oppressed majority, the Shia, into positions of power which they had not expected. The Shia did not earn this position. They did not do it through revolutionary struggle or through winning out a power game. They did it as a result of the invasion of Iraq and the upending of Iraq's power structures. But it's an inevitable consequence of that. The Shia were empowered. They used that power that was given to them in ways that strengthened and extended their control over the state. And in the process, the reversal of what they thought were decades, if not centuries, of discrimination was part and parcel of the post-Saddam order. The second outcome, which again disturbs not only the power relationships inside Iraq, but disturbs the state system in the Middle East, is the rise of the Kurds. The Kurds, as you may know, were one of the afterthoughts of World War I. They featured in the Treaty of Sèvres, where they were given a kind of promise for a national homeland, but none of the post-Ottoman states recognized that treaty. It remained unsigned, and their national home became submerged, as it were, in the formation of various states in the Middle East, including modern Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and to a lesser extent in Syria. The Kurds, who had some kind of autonomous status after the first Gulf War, after 1991, emerged onto the scene as very important power brokers, but with ambiguous objectives as to their relationships with the Iraqi state. Were they part and parcel of Iraq, albeit a distinct nation within it, or was the Kurdish state or statelet in Iraq going to be the genesis of a larger Kurdish state or Kurdish nation state? So that was another disruptive outcome of the invasion of Iraq. The third outcome is that basically the political culture of Iraq, which was dominated by one dictatorship after another, leading to the authoritarianism of the early Ba'ath and then the form of totalitarianism that the later Ba'ath imposed in Iraq. That form of politics, the politics of strong central power, of strong men, of big men, dominating the political scene and using repression and terror when necessary, that has given way to a form of democratic politics. Now, I'm not saying that Iraq is a democracy, it's not. But the forms in which politics are being conducted take some of the attributes of democratic processes, and therefore, in my mind, they will become a feature of the Iraqi state as we go forward. So democracy in the form of constitutions, elections, a political process, and so on, is part and parcel, I believe, of the post-Saddam order. It's very unlikely that Iraq will ever go back to the kind of military dictatorships or one-party states that we had in the past. Lastly, the invasion and occupation of Iraq coincided with the rise of Iran as a regional power. Now, Iran has been quietly, after the Gulf War, after the Iran-Iraq War, and throughout the 1990s, has been quietly building up its regional power base and has been building up, obviously, its military power and its nuclear capabilities. And in the process, Iraq, where the Shia have become empowered, has become a very tempting lever or tool for Iranian expansion, whether it is legitimate or not is another matter, into the region. So the upending of the power structures of Iraq and dismantling of the Ba'athist state, the empowerment of the Shia, and to a much lesser extent the threat that may be posed to Iran by a Kurdish state, has coincided with the rise of Iran in the region and the rise of Iran as an important player. So these are really monumental effects, monumental consequences of the war, none of which were in any shape or form considered. I mean, I can say that with first-hand experience, that none of these issues were tackled in any serious way prior to the war. There was no attempt to gauge or calibrate the consequences of the invasion of Iraq, except by a constant repetition that the United States and the Western alliance generally hoped to produce a kind of democratic, liberal, secular order which would be under some kind of benign American tutelage in the short term and then join the Western camp in the medium and long term. All of these, of course, had a very powerful negative effect on the community that was then in power, which was the Sunni Arab community. Iraqi politics has never been, until the last possibly 20 years, couched in such narrow sectarian terms. It was more to do with things like the role of the state, things like modernization, issues such as, especially in the 1950s and 60s, ideological issues such as Arab nationalism, socialism, communism, and so on. But lurking underneath that was always the implicit, unresolved issue of the Sunni and Shia, the relative differential distribution of power between the two communities. And in the last decades of Saddam's rule, throughout the 1990s, the sectarian base of his power became more and more pronounced. And his oppressive acts and his repression against the Shia, particularly the dramatic governmental repression after the 1991 uprising in the south, which led to the massacre of nearly 300,000 to 400,000 people, and this is clearly documented, basically alienated the Shia from the Iraqi state. So when that order collapsed with the American invasion, the Sunni Arab community, which had ruled Iraq in an implicit manner, but became complicit, as it were, in the rule of Saddam, became disempowered and in the process launched the insurgency. All of these, as I said, created the turmoil and the conditions the consequences of which we are still facing. Of course, they were exacerbated by the incredibly poor performance of the United States in managing the affairs of the country under occupation. And in parenthesis, I would add, although the British had an involvement in the management of the country, particularly in the south, nearly all the key decisions were taken by the United States at the CPA level, and very, very few of them had any positive effect in terms of the management of the country. So you had this tumultuous set of circumstances. Basically, I don't want to use, but I'll use it anyway, tectonic shifts in the power structures inside the country and in the area, worsened by a very, very poor administrative and management of the country, and then subsequently an even poorer response to the insurgency by the use of inappropriate counterinsurgency methods, which made the insurgency worse than it was. So these issues are now beginning to generate their own responses. The challenge to the rise of the Shia in the country is not really one that is easily absorbed by the nearby Arab countries. The nearby Arab countries are to a large extent dominated by the Sunni Arabs, because the Sunni Arabs are 90% of the Muslim world. But nevertheless, there are important Shia minorities, in some cases majorities, in the case of Bahrain, or pluralities in the case of Lebanon, but important Shia minorities in countries like Saudi Arabia and other countries in the GCC, such as Kuwait. And the threat of a Shia ascendancy, in one way or another tied, legitimately or otherwise, to Iran, has created very, very serious issues in these countries. How are they going to deal with this apparent and unstoppable rise of the Shia in Iraq, and how is that going to affect their own internal politics and the power relationships in the area? And you can see how that has spilled over into countries such as Lebanon and in the war of last summer, where the post-war problems have now become crystallized as a Shia-Sunni issue in Lebanon, and it has never been couched in these terms before. The Lebanese crisis in the past was always to do with other communities, but this time the containment of the Shia and their explicit linkage with Iran has become a serious problem. So the post-Ottoman order in the Middle East, which includes the major countries of the Near East, and to some extent also Saudi Arabia, which was created as a result of the overthrow of the Hashemite kingdom of the Hijaz, has to relate to this new body, as it were, that is not born out of the same background that these countries have. and containing it or dealing with it has proved to be a very, very serious problem. What's happening now is that because of the way in which these issues are being couched, they're being couched as existential issues. They need not be, but many countries in the Middle East are feeling threatened and deeply threatened in terms of their own legitimacy, in terms of their own internal power equilibrium by recent events in Iraq and by the apparently continuing and continuous control over the state structures by the Shia community. Shia in Iraq work through the agency of a political party called the United Iraqi Alliance. It's an unstable equilibrium of various factions, but it is united by its commitment to maintaining the control over the various state organs and the structures of the country. So they have not yet reached the point where they feel comfortable about their control. So we have, on one hand, threats that are being seen to be vital to the existence of a number of countries in the area. On the other hand, you have an internal political system in Iraq that has not yet gelled around majority, minority, political parties or even groups. It's still, as it were, a work in progress. While the United States is now, or the Bush administration in particular, is seeing, as it were, the length of time it has allotted to it to turn the situation around, shrinking by the day. And the policies that the Bush administration appears to be choosing for the balance of its tenure in power for the next 18 months or so are ones that are really designed to basically double or quits. It's what a gambler would do when he has lost a great deal and has very little chips left. Rather than try to contain the problem through diplomatic and political means, appears on the surface they have chosen to confront it militarily and to double their stakes by confronting not only the insurgents and the Shia militias inside Iraq, but confronting and challenging Iran. In the process, they are going to unleash another set of very fearsome consequences, I believe. The way in which they're confronting Iran, primarily in a military way, it may succeed if it breaks, as it were, the internal Iranian consensus that Iran is entitled to some kind of nuclear program of its own. Whether there's a consensus about nuclear weapons is another matter. It's challenging that militarily. It's going to drive up the sense of Iranian patriotism and nationalism, which is always lurking below the surface, and is a very powerful impulse in Iran. And it's going to unite all kinds of groups around the current state system in Iran in order to confront or to address the challenge coming from the United States. It's also going to force the Iraqi government basically a Hobson's choice. Either you support whatever the United States chooses to do vis-à-vis Iran, and the implications on Iraq are grave, or the United States is telling them you have to be explicit about your dependence on Iran, and therefore you are an implicit enemy of the United States project in Iraq, whatever that may be. The government right now, or the United Iraqi Alliance, is, as it were, trying to balance these two considerations. On one hand, it is dependent in varying extent, varying dependency of its factions on Iran is clear. But on the other hand, it has to face the fact that it may lose the U.S. security umbrella, which is the only guarantee for its continuity in power. So currently, as I said, the government is trying to balance these conflicting pressures on it in a shrinking space. And in a matter of a few weeks or a few months, I think if nothing changes in terms of either the American military confrontation with Iran or the security situation inside Iraq, then I think this government will probably crack. The other effects of the current escalation of the crisis is, in my mind, probably more dangerous, and that is the deepening and worsening and the exacerbation of the tensions between the Shias and the Sunnis. Now, Shias and Sunnis have not been irrespective of what people say, have not been at loggerheads throughout history. In fact, there are very few instances where the two communities conflicted and came to blows. In many cases, if one reads Islamic history, there were more divisions within the Sunni communities themselves, between various schools of thought, than between the Shias and the Sunnis. It's only when Shiism became, as it were, enshrined as a state religion of Iran and became part of its external religious and foreign policy did it become a real issue. But there was not much of an issue until very recently, because the power system basically kept the Arab Shias, and we're talking here about the Arab Shias, in a subordinate relationship, and therefore was not seen to be a threat. But now that Iraq has basically the genie is out of the bottle in Iraq, and the fears in the minds of the main rulers of the Middle East are real, that the Shias' primary loyalty, falsely I believe, are those ultimately go to Iran, which makes nonsense, frankly, of any sense of Shia patriotism, which is very, very strong in Iraq and Lebanon and other Gulf countries. Therefore, there is a Shia challenge, as it were, to the Sunni orthodoxy, and we now face the possibility not only of two communities that have been at historic odds, but not at loggerheads, moving to another plane of their confrontation, one which in the past was limited to polemics and religious diatribes, to ones where people actually get killed and communities get uprooted and people become refugees or displaced persons. It is already happening in Iraq to a very large extent. And the scale of it may go on even more if this exacerbation of Sunni Shia tensions, which are not entirely, I might add, the result of the policy of President Bush. It's a consequence of an unguarded and ill-considered expansion of the military confrontation. The Sunni Shia issues have also been worsened greatly by the work of the various Wahhabist elements and the so-called Takfiri or Salafi jihadi ideologies that have become embedded in a very powerful way within the Sunni community. Part of the culture of coexistence between the Shias and the Sunnis in the past was a substantial common ground, which was used to bridge some of the differences, common habits, common practices, and a mutual respect and recognition of the boundaries, as it were, of the two communities, and especially at points where they conflicted with each other. That has been rudely shattered over the last 4 or 5 decades, primarily through the expansion of the Salafi jihadi ideology, which, if one tracks its growth, is really directly correlated to the rise of the petrodollar economies, and particularly Saudi Arabia. So you have a radicalization of the Sunni religious discourse that has been taking place irrespective of what has been happening in Iraq or anywhere else in the Middle East, coinciding with increasing or heightened tensions and fears of a Shia ascendancy, thereby creating fertile ground for a very serious ethnic conflict, which can go, or sectarian conflict, which can go beyond Iraq and can go into countries, as I said, like Lebanon, can go into small countries like Bahrain, which are in a precarious balance, and even beyond into countries like Pakistan, where nearly a quarter of the population is Shia. So this escalation that's taking place now, the basic rejection of a diplomatic and political solution to the Iraq crisis, has in it the seeds of very, very dangerous some consequences. Where do we go from here? First of all, we have to ask, this experience that Iraq has had with occupation, has it left anything of note, any positive effects? I believe there are two. I say that guardedly, but I believe that they are irreversible, and by and large they are good, in quotes. One is a political process that, irrespective of the fact that it was very, very poorly managed, it led to all kinds of manipulations and all kinds of distortions. did achieve certain objectives. One of them is it introduced a culture of elections, the culture of organized political parties, and it also introduced, for the first time since the 1920s, a constitution which, in spite of all of its flaws and its problems, is nevertheless a document that most Iraqis agree about most of the time. And if there are any issues in it, they can be subject to debate. So we have a framework that is, by and large, positive as a result of a political process, which important communities boycotted initially, but then have joined. So we have, as it were, the skeleton of a new political order. At the same time, one of the positive effects of the post-Saddam occupation and the governments after that is the beginning, the small shoots of a democratic culture, and particularly things like the media, to some extent the courts. They're shambolic, they are corrupt, they're full of holes, but nevertheless, it is unlikely that we'll go back to completely a system where the courts are just the handmaidens of power and the media is just trumpets, whatever the Ministry of Information says. But these two positive effects, I think, are being again distorted and disfigured by the way in which politics is being conducted. I mean, a democratic process might lead to something like a Western liberal democracy, or it can lead to its caricature, which is what we have in many countries in the Middle East, which have a democratic culture, like Lebanon, for example, where the process is hijacked by the politics of za'amat, or leaders and big men, and all the negative consequences associated with a political order that depends on landlords, depends on powerful local figures, as sort of the borough system that you had here in the 18th century. At the same time, the process in Iraq is hardening as the United Iraqi Alliance seeks to cement its hold over the government. It in turn is coming under the control of certain individuals who have a different kind of political outlook, more aimed at power distribution rather than power sharing, which is what I think Iraq needs. The way in which the outcome of the current process is basically to distribute power by saying X percent goes to this block, Y percent to this block, and Z percent to that block, rather than a genuine attempt to overcome the differences and create a system whereby power is shared. So we may end up with a democratic order that is dominated by big men, that in turn dominates a fixed parliamentary majority, while the civic politics has to operate at a different level. And I think this will work to the detriment of democracy in the medium and long term, and the space for genuine political dialogue becomes reduced. Where do you go from here really depends a great deal on what the United States wants to do with this prize called Iraq. I mean, do they want to keep it as an ally, a permanent ally in their war on terror? Do they want to use it as a foil or counterweight to Iran, and possibly use Iraq as a base in which to undermine Iran? Do they want to use it as a mechanism to manage the evolution and the emergence of a Kurdish state? What about oil politics? The oil years may not last more than 30 years. Beyond that, I think there's a very good chance that alternative energy uses will take place, especially in transport and electricity generation, and oil will cease to be the critical factor it is now. Is Iraq going to be a kind of ally to the United States in the area, the way that, say, South Korea is or Japan is in East Asia? That is, it can always rely on a dependable ally, irrespective of the merits of whatever case they're pursuing. Is Iraq going to be a possible mediator in the Arab-Israeli conflict and become a state that does not necessarily recognize Israel, but is not that is either indifferent or partial to the American-Israeli alliance? Is Iraq going to be used as a lever against other Arab countries? This was one of the main features of the neocon policy that pushed the United States into war. Is that a democratic, liberal Iraq would lead to Iraq becoming a kind of model state, or it can be used to goad and prod countries such as Saudi Arabia, countries such as Egypt, into towing the line? Or does the United States genuinely want to maintain and to create a democratic, liberal order in the Middle East, and has not given up on that in Iraq? I don't think the U.S., frankly, has thought about these issues now. Its only concern currently seems to be how to rescue its military mission. Now, will the United States then use its immense power in Iraq to create what has been called in Turkey the deep state, that is, structures of power and authority that lurk under the surface but are connected in a critical way to the United States? For example, control over the armed forces. For example, control of the security and intelligence forces of Iraq. Currently, the intelligence forces of Iraq, the Iraq National Intelligence Service, is entirely funded by the CIA. It doesn't even feature in the budget of the country. I mean, it's as if MI5 or MI6 is funded by Congress and therefore depends on its guidelines. Control over the senior bureaucrats. This is happening to some extent in the finance and economic area. But apart from that, they've not had much success. And, of course, by co-opting political leaders, including Islamists, which is happening now, and their parties. This is the features of a deep state. They can also do that through economic and policy advisors, through a powerful embassy that acts basically as a surrogate government, which is what the U.S. Embassy does. It knows more about the Iraqi economy and the Iraqi social aspects than the ministry is concerned. And in many ways, ministers have to rely on the United States and their advisors for what's happening in the country. Through what I call legacy projects and systems, in spite of the corruption, waste, and theft of the reconstruction program, America has left behind a number of important infrastructure projects. These need to be maintained. These need to be funded, and they come in also with a kind of dependent baggage. Through a military presence, which is the most obvious way of maintaining your influence and control, and by linking Iraq to the hundreds of bases that the United States maintains abroad, sort of this archipelago of control that they have. Will Iraq feature into that? I don't know. But whatever the U.S. project, assuming it's thought out rationally and objectively in these terms, as a nation state or a superpower certainly needs to do, they still have to contend with the fact that the working majority in Iraq is Shia. There is nevertheless a connection with Iran which they have to contend with. And the Shia may not confront Iran. There's also the issue of the insurgency and the issue of the U.S. allies in the area who may continue to resist the existence of an explicitly Shia government in Iraq. These are really the issues that Iraq is facing right now, and whether these are going to be resolved in a diplomatic way, in a way that emphasizes political means and processes, rather than the apparent reliance of the latter-day Bush administration on military power, is really an issue. Even the military solution itself may not necessarily lead to the stability that the Americans are seeking, even if they put in 500,000 troops and occupy the country completely, reconquer it basically. There are military constraints. There's no doubt that the U.S. military budget is seriously overstretched. There are problems with recruitment into the military, into the U.S. military. There are also financial constraints. I mean, the cost of the Iraq war now is nowhere near the cost of the Vietnam war, vis-à-vis as a ratio to GNP. But nevertheless, it's creeping that way. It's taking up something like 20% of the Pentagon's budget this year. And there are, of course, political constraints from Congress, from Democrats, waning popular support. And I was in the U.S. in the 1960s, and I could see as the tipping point, somewhere around 66, 67. We are probably near there now in the United States. I just came back recently from an extended visit there, and I think that public opinion really has shifted. I outlined in an article I wrote in The Independent about a month ago on a proposed way out of this. It is mainly to do with basically the two ascendant communities, the Shias and the Kurds, retreating a bit from their demands, the Sunnis accepting a kind of halfway house which perhaps overcompensates them for their loss of power, and a strong devolution of power in the form of large regions or at least multi-province configurations. I also called for the establishment of the beginnings of linkages between Iraq and the rest of the Arab world. The Sunni Arab community in Iraq feels that Iraq is moving away from its Arab roots, reconnecting the Middle East in the form of supranational institutions and organizations, something like the early days of the EU, like the European Coal and Steel Community, something like that. Also emphasizing softer issues like human and community rights. It's something that Iraq should push for. That is a new set of institutional arrangements that bring together the states of the Near East, the post-Ottoman states in the Near East. I also called for the establishment of regional security arrangements that bring in not only the Arab countries of the Near East and Turkey, but specifically Iran, and to create a new regional security pact, aimed initially perhaps to some form of anti-terrorism pact, but to create the core of a regional dialogue on security issues. The United States in the past has supported regional associations of this kind, such as ASEAN, which has moved from being a purely economic arrangement, something in the last 18 months it's becoming much more concerned with security arrangements. And we're talking about countries there that range across military dictatorships like Burma, to communist countries like Vietnam, to postmodern not liberal, but postmodern states such as Singapore. I also called for the creation of new administrative reforms in Iraq that would create two separate units that would oversee the reconstruction and economic plan, and at the same time one that has oversight over the security ministries to keep them out of political control. And all of these I have espoused that they should not be imposed unilaterally or from abroad or by individual political leaders, but should have firm parliamentary support and should be part of the process by which Parliament in Iraq begins to have its voice heard and to seize the political agenda, as it were. Currently, it is not more than a mouthpiece for the main political parties and the leaders behind them. And from time to time, the debate, as you may have seen recently, collapses into chaos. But parliamentary or constitutional support for these reforms and changes are designed to give some kind of credibility or credence to an Iraqi government trying to assert its authority and control. At this point, I shall end this short talk, and if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It is an extremely sobering panorama, and I'm sure we're extremely grateful for your very forensic analysis. There is a roving microphone. It is roving. Please indicate, yes, there's a gentleman there. It would be helpful if you could tell us your name and any relevant affiliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And please, we have a very short time, and brevity would be appreciated very much.
Sure. Neil Partrick, The Economist Intelligence Unit. I just wanted to ask Dr. Allawi whether he thought that in that awkward bridge between US interests and Iranian interests and the possible contradiction between the two in Iraq that you mentioned and the dilemmas for the alliance in Iraq in that context, the ruling UIA, whether you thought the US had basically made up its mind to go with Skiri, with al-Hakim, amenable to dialogue, saying fairly soft things in terms of Iran without breaking with Iran, obviously, and also proving somewhat exempt from the proposed crackdown in terms of the role of Shia militias. Do we have the emergence of a Skiri-dominated state that the US feels it can somehow do business with?
I think it's a very accurate observation, although it's in the form of a question, but I agree with you. I think that the United States basically has decided that it can deal with Skiri. Whether Skiri has long-standing relationships with Iran, and they should not be belittled. I find it difficult how they can basically square the circle, but it's a decision that they have made. They seem to think that they can deal with Sayyid Abdulaziz al-Hakim, and they may be correct in the sense that Iran will be able to operate within these constraints. Whether the recent trip of Abdulaziz Hakim to Iran was to do with putting the finer touches to this plan, or to receive Iranian encouragement or disagreement with it, is something that I'm not sure of. But the United States has been working towards a kind of tripartite control over the country by cutting deals with Skiri, the Kurds obviously, and the Tawafaq bloc, which is the former dominated by the former Muslim Brothers, the Islamic Party of Iraq. But I think this assumes that there is a moderate center, as it were, upon which all groups will coalesce. But there are serious issues that can break this very easily. One of them that's looming is, of course, the status of the city of Kirkuk.
John Bailey, freelance journalist. Last week in the New York Times, an editorial suggested that whilst exhorting Mr. Bush to find a diplomatic and political answer to the problems of Iraq, said that Iran certainly is helping arm and train Shiite militias. And these militias enjoy the protection of Iraq's Prime Minister, Mr. al-Maliki. He suggests further that Mr. Bush should be worried and should demand that Mr. Maliki cuts these terms with these militia groups or suffers the consequences, which I think you outlined in terms of the cracking, as you said, of this government. How would you regard that piece? As fundamentally correct or as an assumption?
No, I think it is mainly correct, but not with the same kind of intensity that the New York Times has talked about. The Iranian support to the Shia militias really takes the form of certain factions within the Mahdi army are backed by Iran directly and probably guided by Iran. But this, of course, ignores the fact that the Badr Brigade, which is connected with Skiri, is in fact far more organized and integrated into the Iranian Revolutionary Guards than the militias of the Mahdi army are, which really dovetails into the earlier question, is that while you are able to deal with Skiri at the political level, there are very, very strong links with Iran that go back to the early 1980s in terms of the training and the command and control of the Badr Brigade. One of the main leaders of the Badr organization, who became an MP subsequently, has been, they're trying to track him down in Baghdad recently, but it shows you that the connections between the Badr Brigade and Iran are really, probably in my mind, more important than those between certain Iranian groups and factions within the Mahdi army in terms of long term. I think Mr. Maliki, Prime Minister Maliki, came from a background that he does not enjoy, as it were, political depth in terms of the Dawah party or the groups that supported him. I don't think he ever aspired to be Prime Minister or sought to be Prime Minister. He became Prime Minister as a result of the Anglo-American decision to veto the election of Dr. Jafari. So he was thrust into this situation without necessarily seeking it. And he was thrust into that with the definite help of the Sadrist bloc, which are the main, or those groups associated with the Mahdi army. He is ambivalent. He was ambivalent until recently as to how far he can crack down. on the Mahdi army. But I think now that this security plan is going ahead, it appears to me that the less disciplined elements of the Sadrs are being targeted now.
Mohammed Madani, Maghrib Review, and I'm also a fellow in this house. What are your relations with the Arab world, and how much support do you have within the Arab population in the Arab world?
I mean, Iraq's relationships with the Arab world are strained, because the Arab countries, probably with the exception of Kuwait, did not recognize either the invasion, the occupation, or the post-occupation order in Iraq. Very few of them supported the political process. And in many cases, the Arab countries have been involved in supporting, at one level, political dissidents and opponents to the change, and at the other level, insurgents and terrorists. So the relationship with the Arab countries is very, very strained, primarily because what I try to outline here is that what has happened in Iraq is really threatens them, or is seen to be threatening them in a serious way. What the government is trying to do about it is to try to ameliorate some of their concerns, and is trying to find some common grounds by which they are able to overcome these issues. But in the case of 3 countries, it's very difficult to do that without going to the root of the problem. In Saudi Arabia, there's fear of a Shia ascendancy. The state is supported by the religious, by the clerical classes who are steeped in Wahhabi doctrine, and they are concerned about a shift in the balance of power in the area to the advantage of Iran. In the case of Syria, it's both the fear that the Ba'ath Party is targeted, and they were explicitly targeted by the neocons before the war, and they are obviously concerned about their survivability. In the case of Jordan, which is not much mentioned, Jordan is concerned that a shift in Iraq's relationships in the Middle East towards Iran will threaten its economic links with the country. And recently, of course, it feels threatened by the huge flow of refugees into the country. Nearly 800,000 Iraqis are now waiting it out in Jordan.
Jerry Asher, Chair, RSA. Looking at the situation from Britain's standpoint, with a special relationship with the US, with the position we hold within the European Union, and our commitment as well in terms of our own forces. If in 6 months' time you were required to give advice to our new Prime Minister as to our strategy for the next 12, 18 months, what would it be?
I tried to outline what I thought should be the strategy that would work for Iraq as well as for its friends and allies. And I think it would be to take more seriously the recommendations of the Baker-Hamilton group and to push towards a much more inclusive arrangement with the various Arab countries as well as the non-Arab regional powers, and to try to bring them into a kind of grand settlement for the area that would maybe not tackle the Arab-Israeli issue, leave that aside, but tackle the fundamental issues that these countries have to confront as a result of the change of the political order in Iraq. Now, without us confronting them directly, perhaps prompted by a major power like Britain, this thing can go on for another decade without any resolution. And then the kind of resolution that might come out at the end of it is going to be unacceptable to the Iraqi people. It might involve huge ethnic cleansing, it might involve new refugee problems, a completely collapsed state, until a new equilibrium is worked out. This is the alternative, as I see it. So Britain is obliged, in my mind. And I don't want to go back to history and say that basically the British caused this problem, but the fact of the matter is that they have been involved and engaged in it, and they have a huge reservoir of knowledge and interest in Iraq. And they should have known that of the consequences of this rather outlandish decision to invade and occupy the country. It's not too late. I think they have to, whether Prime Minister Blair can do it given his small burning fuse left, I don't know, but the new Prime Minister should really begin to seriously challenge, not confront, but challenge the United States in its policy, assuming this surge doesn't lead to any meaningful results.
Dominic Brett, European Commission representation in the United Kingdom. In the longer term, do you see a viable and constructive role for the European Union in Iraq?
Yes, I think so. I think it is really critical that Iraq is seen to be what it is, that it's basically a land that abuts on a number of different countries and regions and civilizations, and therefore it can form the heart of new sets of arrangements, particularly supranational arrangements in the Middle East. I mean, the experience of the European Union in building such institutions made up from countries that have been at war for centuries is really something that we can, not just Iraq, but the region can benefit from. And if the Iraqi government decides that this is something that is in the interest of Iraq and regional stability, then I think the EU can be quite an important player in working out the kind of institutions and structures that can be put together that would bridge the various gaps that exist in the Middle East, and from a political point of view, give comfort to the Sunni Arab population that Iraq's Arab links are not going to be discarded under the new dispensation, as it were. So I think it can play a very important role in recreating, as it were, a confederation of Middle Eastern Arab states, not in the Arab Union sense of the word, but in the sense of having a large commonality of interest expressed through institutions that have supranational status and that have powerful constitutional and legal backing to them.
Sharur, Open Democracy. There are some US presidential candidates who have proposed or have offered to withdraw US troops from Iraq in 2008. Do you think the setting of a timetable for the withdrawal of US troops is a productive measure? And what would you caution Democratic candidates to propose in this regard?
I think a unilateral decision of this kind is not really conducive to stability. That doesn't mean that you should not have a timetable as part of a larger regional program to settle the various issues and conflicts that exist in Iraq and elsewhere in the area. I think that once you start the process of engaging other countries in a regional security pact, once you start the process of having some kind of new supranational constellation of Middle Eastern institutions, once this gets going, then I think it is imperative that a timetable is set. But as of today, if the timetable is only linked to the reduction and then elimination of the US military exposure in Iraq, and it is only seen from the perspective of US domestic politics, then I don't think it's very useful.
Aris Narayana, what do you think are Iran's long-term ambitions in the region?
I think Iran is not the bogeyman that many people think it is. It's a very large, powerful player in the area that, for a variety of reasons, has been excluded from participating. I'd like to remind the audience that in the 1970s, when the Shah was ascendant, Iran's power was not seen in the same terms as it is now. In fact, the entire Gulf security order was based on Iranian supremacy in the area. And these countries that are now frightened of a Shia ascendancy were not frightened of the Shah's power of those days. It is more to do, I think, the fear of Iran is more to do with this Islamic or theocratic form of government rather than Iran per se. So you have to really recouch the question. Iran has not had very serious, in spite of what people hear about age-old struggles between Persians and Arabs. The fact of the matter is that the Arabs have been living under Ottoman rule for nearly 400 years, and before that they were living under all kinds of Balkanized regimes that had no Arab feature to them. So the boundaries between the Iranian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which Iraq inherited, have not really changed that much for the last 300 years, with the exception of a few meters of riverland on the Shatt al-Arab waterway. It is the demonization of Iran, first of all by Arab nationalists, who thought of Iran as somehow an expansionist power. And at the same time, the fear that the Iranian experiment in theocracy, as it were, will have a contagion effect in the area, is what really makes people have this rather peculiar perspective on Iran. I do not think Iran has any territorial ambitions on Iraq. I think Iran wants to have a say in Iraq. I think Iran wants to make sure that the Shia ascendancy in Iraq is not reversed in any way. I think Iran also wants to see that Iraq is no longer a military threat to it, as it was in the Iran-Iraq war, and that the system of government is not threatened by a large military presence of the United States in Iraq that would challenge it. It's not that Iran is completely free of flaws. Of course, it has other and has very dastardly schemes and intelligence operatives. There are probably 30,000 Iranian intelligence operatives in Iraq right now. Not Iranians, but Iraqis who are linked with them. But you have to put that, I think, in the larger context of things. And accommodating Iran is different from appeasing it. You have to see whether whatever concessions or whatever dialogue or engagement leads to appeasement or leads to accommodation. I prefer to think of Iran as part of a regional order rather than build a wall between the Arabs and the Iranians, which wall might well have to be dismantled if the Iranian government changes or something else happens. So regional security, I think, implies that you have to engage with these countries, even though you may not like their political systems.
Dr. Allawi, I'd like to thank you very much indeed in this extremely threatening situation, and I'm sure that many of us feel we haven't seen the worst of it yet. It is extremely rewarding to listen to an account which is both expert and realistic, but also constructive, and I must thank you very warmly and invite the audience to do the same.